Hello. I am starting the stream 9 or 10 minutes early as normal. We will be starting our study at 7. So if you're watching this after the fact, don't forget, fast forward 9 or 10 minutes. Otherwise, you're just going to stare at me as I mess around with my phone. Jelly beans.
Thank you for my thing.
You're welcome. I'm sure watching me eat jelly beans is riveting YouTube viewing.
Live now.
Mm-hmm.
Funny if we just start chatting through the chat box.
That would be weird. This will be really weird to people that don't realize we're in the same room. It might be weird to people who do realize we're in the same room.
Green and the black are really hard to tell apart.
Except the grape ones say Starburst on the side.
Just barely, because like this one was
Yeah.
almost rubbed off.
You'll have to just live dangerously,
Mhm.
never knowing if a jelly bean is grape or licorice.
Mhm. I guess I should show you Amanda's post from earlier.
Yeah. Well, it's 7,
It is.
so we should go ahead and start. So, in the last chapter that we studied, in chapter 7, you have it marked? Okay. In the last study, we looked at the beginning of the confrontation that was between Moses and Pharaoh, or at least that's how it started. Because Moses goes into Pharaoh and says, God says, let my people go, etc. Right? And it looks like that confrontation is between those two, but it really isn't. Pharaoh initially tries some politics in order to manipulate that feeling of the confrontation between being those two guys, right? And he tries to make Moses into the bad guy by punishing the Israelites because of him. And that makes them upset, and they don't really like Moses very much, and they don't pay any attention to anything he says, right? But then the plagues start, right? And we saw the first one last week, which was turning the water of the Nile into blood. And that really shifts the perspective and the context of this, because Moses did not turn the Nile to blood. God turned the Nile to blood, right? Moses can't do that. So really what happens over the next 4 chapters, because this goes on through chapter 11, is the confrontation between Pharaoh, who is believed to be the personified deity Horus, literally the son of the god Ra in Egyptian religion. So it's a confrontation between him and God, the God of the world, right? Yahweh, the guy that introduced himself and gave his name at the burning bush. So as the plagues progress, initially we'll see this group of people that are translated as magicians, but it would be better to see them as priests, right? Initially, they will try to replicate some of the things that happen in order to prove that, they have power to do similar things, right? But they can't fix any of the things that God is doing. But eventually they'll tap out, and we'll see that come up later on today. So we talked about that last week. We also talked about how we kind of glossed over this, and I'm not sure how clearly we got to it, but there's more than one way to look at the plagues. So some people view the plagues as natural events that are theologized in this book. So they view those natural disasters as being something that the Israelites and the Egyptians looked at as having supernatural meaning, and they insert this sort of naturalistic, hey Jim, a naturalistic explanation into things, right? Some people will look at the plagues and say, oh, well, they're targeted at specific Egyptian gods. And some of them are really easy to see how that works. But it doesn't quite work for all of them. And we'll see that as we move on. Also, some of the plagues aren't that specific in exactly what happens. So it's not 100% certain that we can look at them as specifically targeting, you know what I mean, Egyptian gods. Because there's a couple of times when it's just not quite clear. But you could make the same argument. It doesn't really work out perfectly to look at the plagues as natural disasters, because there's the explanations that are given for that in popular scholarship break down, right? They make it seem like it makes sense for a couple of 2 or 3 plagues, and then it sort of falls apart. Another way to look at the plagues is that they're cast as acts of decreation. And that might take a little bit of explanation. But in the same way that God created the world, the ancient people would look at that as imposing order on chaos, right? They would look at the way Genesis is written, and they wouldn't only see the act of creating the world, but they would also see the act of imposing order on the world, like determining where the stars go, determining the times for the day and the night, determining where the water goes, right? They would look at that as imposing some order. So then if that's your perspective, then you might look at the plagues in Exodus as removing that order, right? Taking apart creation and letting chaos come back in and be destructive, right? And I think personally that's the perspective that I favor, because this is another thing that we talked about last week. Pharaoh's job is to maintain order, right? And if God proves that Pharaoh can't, then in the contest, the battle of wills between Pharaoh and God, then Pharaoh is the one that's defeated. And that's kind of how this whole thing goes, right? And we'll see when we get to the last plague is specifically targeted not just at the firstborn of, every house and every animal, but also it specifically stops pharaonic succession. But that's for later. That's for next week. So with all that as the backdrop, whether you look at the plagues as natural disasters, whether you look at them as targeting Egyptian gods, whether you look at them as targeting Pharaoh's inability to maintain order, all of them you can put in the category of God proving who he is, right? Because regardless of which way you explain them, God uses them to make a point. And we'll see that more clearly as we go. So I guess I'm starting with that in order to say that if you read somebody or hear somebody say that, oh, well, you don't have to care about any of that stuff because it's just these natural processes, or, oh, it doesn't really mean anything, that's just, taking shots at the Egyptian gods. You can't explain it away that way, because the point of it, theologically, the point that the book is trying to communicate is who is Pharaoh and who is God? Who's the winner here? Because whether it's natural or supernatural, God uses it to accomplish what he wants and Pharaoh doesn't. So with all that as the backdrop, we come to Exodus 8, verse 1. So this is just after the Nile was turned to blood and the Egyptians couldn't find any water, so they're digging along the banks of the Nile to look for water. So 8:1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go into Pharaoh and tell him, this is what Yahweh says. Let my people go so they may worship me. But if you refuse to let them go, then I will plague your territory with frogs. The Nile will swarm with frogs, and they will come up and go into your palace, into your bedroom, and on your bed, into the houses of your officials and your people, and into your ovens and kneading bowls." Comment from Jim: even if they were natural processes, they each occurred when Yahweh said they would occur. Exactly. Right? Like, whether they were 100% miraculous or natural processes with miraculous timing, they still happened in such a way that they accomplished what God wanted to do. Right? There's no getting away from having something be miraculous. That being said, with a lot of scholars, the natural explanation is popular because I guess some of them are afraid of having miracles in the Bible, which seems, well, either that or they just don't believe anything they read anyway. Nevertheless, I don't think any of us that are watching this right now are terribly afraid of there being miracles in the Bible. But yes, good point. 4. The frogs will come up on you, your people, and all your officials. Now, this is one that if you're looking at the plagues as pokes at specific gods, this one is easy, right? Because there was a specific Egyptian god of frogs called Hecate. I don't know. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly at all. Not my fault. But there's also a little bit of a reference to some stuff that happened earlier in the book. Because this particular deity, their god of frogs, her job was to control one of her jobs was to control the multiplication of frogs, right? Because they needed frogs to eat bugs, but they didn't need too many frogs, right? So she was responsible for maintaining that balance. At the same time, she was also a fertility goddess. And in the Egyptian collection of deities, she was the wife of a god named Khnum. Now, Khnum was the god that the Egyptians thought of as fashioning children on his potter's wheel, right? And the idiom of the birthing stool, when you see people at the birthing stool that we saw earlier, a couple few chapters ago, when Pharaoh had told the Egyptian midwives to kill the Hebrew babies, that reference to the birthing stool was the reference to how the Egyptians believed that Khnum formed babies. And this frog goddess, as a fertility goddess, she was part of that process in Egyptian thinking, right? So at the same time, you have a poke at the inability of the Egyptian gods and the inability of Pharaoh to maintain order. You also have a reference to, hey, remember that time you tried to destroy my people? And this specific idea of the birthing stool, meaning the potter's wheel, was used in that passage. Yeah, remember that thing? Well, that set of gods, those things that couldn't prevent the Israelites from spreading, they also have no power here, right? So I think there's a little bit of literary irony going on in poking at this specific deity, because the Egyptians have plenty. They can pick any that they want. But this one very pointedly calls out something very evil that the previous Pharaoh had done. Okay, 5. The Lord then said to Moses, "Tell Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the rivers, canals, and ponds, and cause the frogs to come up onto the land of Egypt." When Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. But the magicians did the same thing by their occult practices and brought frogs up onto the land of Egypt. So, as we saw previously, when the magicians try to replicate the things that Moses tells Aaron to do, they can't undo any of these things, right? A few times they're able to do something similar, but they can't actually undo the plagues, right? And we said this yesterday or last week, but it bears repeating. These magicians that we're talking about are best thought of as priests, right? And their role is to serve as priests. And in the context that we're talking about, magic is something that is inherently spiritual. The idea is that they have power granted to them by their gods because of their service as priests, right? Yes, the priest made matters worse. Exactly. They can't make anything better, right? They can't create order. All they can do is make it worse.
Weird question.
Yeah.
So in 8:1
Mm-hmm.
and 8:5, they both have notes. So I kind of get, I guess, 8:1 where it says that it, in some text, it's the end of 7.
Mm-hmm.
But then 8:5 references 8:1, but doesn't make sense. Is it saying basically in some texts 8:5 is the beginning of this section?
I don't have that note in mind. Yeah, let me.
There and there. At least I'm assuming.
Oh, in the Hebrew Bible, the versification and chapter divisions are not the same.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some things that end up in one chapter, not the other.
But this is basically saying 8:5 is sometimes the beginning of this section.
Well, in the Hebrew translation.
Right, but that's what that means.
Right. Okay. How far did we get?
We finished 7.
We finished 7, so we're on 8. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Ask Yahweh to remove the frogs from me and my people. Then I will let the people go, and they can sacrifice to Yahweh." And he almost admits what's really going on here. He needs to ask Yahweh to do it. He can't do it himself, right? Pharaoh cannot impose order on the world.
I wonder if it's just because with the last one, it probably took about 7 days for the water to cycle itself. And he's like, I don't want to deal with this for 7 days.
No idea. No clue. Although you do make a good point. The timings of these plagues are not always specific,
Mhm.
right? So we'll get into that a little bit later. But just keep it in your heads. The timings are not always stated. Moses said to Pharaoh, "You make the choice rather than me. When should I ask on behalf of you, your officials and your people, that the frogs be taken away from you and your houses and remain only in the Nile? Tomorrow," he answered. Moses replied, "As you have said, so you may know there is no one like Yahweh our God," which is really the point of this contest. It's to prove that, right? "The frogs will go away from you, your houses, your officials, and your people. The frogs will remain only in the Nile." After Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, Moses cried out to the Lord for help concerning the frogs that he had brought against Pharaoh. The Lord did as Moses had said. The frogs in the houses, courtyards, and fields died. They piled them in countless heaps, and there was a terrible odor in the land. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them as the Lord said. And put a little emphasis on that, he hardened his heart, right? So we talked about how sometimes there's an objection about God hardening Pharaoh's heart. Well, several times Pharaoh is explicitly making his own choice here, right?
He's stubborn.
Right. He is stubborn. All on his own, he is stubborn. So a few times, God will use that stubbornness to his advantage for theological purposes. But mostly, Pharaoh is stubborn all on his own. So God is not nudging Pharaoh to do anything that Pharaoh's not already wanting to do, right? 16. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth, and it will become gnats throughout the land of Egypt." Now, there's a little note on the word gnats there. Depending on your translation, yours might say lice. And I suspect that lice is probably,
Sand fleas or mosquitoes.
yeah. So some kind of a pest is what's really the intent here.
Mhm.
And I'm pointing that out because it's distinctive from the next thing that starts happening in verse 20, right? So where your Bible says gnats, think of it as gnats that are really annoying, like fleas or mosquitoes or lice, right? And this could also be looked at as a little bit of a dig on the Egyptian priests, because it was customary for them to shave their entire bodies so that they couldn't have lice. Because, like many different religious groups, they had to remain clean in order to do service in their own temples, right?
Mhm.
Except if everyone's covered in lice, they can't do their own temple service, right? So that's a little bit of a dig also at the Egyptian religious system, not just, hey, there's a bunch of really annoying fleas or gnats or lice or mosquitoes or whatever. Okay. 17. And they did this. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff, and when he struck the dust of the earth, gnats were on man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats throughout the land of Egypt. The magicians tried to produce gnats using their occult practices, but they could not. The gnats remained on man and beast. "This is the finger of God," the magicians said to Pharaoh. But Pharaoh's heart hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. This is where the magicians tap out, right? This is where they admit this is beyond us.
Mhm.
We can't do anything about this.
But it's got to be interesting thing because if you're in front of Pharaoh or
Mhm.
anybody that's that powerful, and you say, "I can't do that,"
Mm-hmm.
aren't they normally like put to death, tortured, labor or something?
I mean, obviously that's up to the ruler, right? We see in other books like Nebuchadnezzar seem to have that kind of attitude a lot of times.
Mhm.
But this Pharaoh apparently does not. Also, it's not going to work well for him to decapitate his entire religious leadership.
I know, but like just thinking for them to actually say we can't do it and we can't figure it out and it's this other
Oh,
thing,
yeah. Yeah, there's
potentially risking their lives.
there's definitely some cracks in the religious unity of Pharaoh and his followers, right? And that's going to become apparent actually in the next chapter, there's going to be an explicit reference to people in Pharaoh's house who are paying attention to what God says, because they're not idiots, right? They have eyeballs. They can see what's going on. So in this particular case, the magicians are not idiots. They have eyeballs. They're going, nope, this is God. We can't do this.
Mhm.
The Lord said to Moses, get up early in the morning and present yourself to Pharaoh when you see him going out to the water. Tell him this is what Yahweh says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. But if you will not let my people go, then I will send swarms of flies against you, your officials, your people, and your houses. The Egyptians' houses will swarm with flies, and so will the land where they live. But on that day I will give special treatment to the land of Goshen, where my people are living. No flies will be there. This way you will know that I, Yahweh, am in the land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. This will take place tomorrow. Okay, so there's a couple of notes here. Note number one, the distinction between the Egyptians and the Israelites, that starts here. So for the rest of the plagues, they're only going to affect the Israelites, or they're only going to affect the Egyptians. The Israelites are going to be spared from what happens in the rest of the plagues. Because what's the point of this entire exercise? God is God. God is the ruler of the universe, not Pharaoh. God is in charge. God is the one with power. Pharaoh is not, right? So God's followers, the people that God is trying to rescue, they're going to be spared. Pharaoh is not. And the people that are loyal to Pharaoh are not. So that's becoming explicit from here on out. Also, the translation flies that's in most Bible translations, that is a speculation.
Mhm.
The word literally says swarms, right? And the implication is swarms of insects, but it's not specific. It could be many kinds of insects. It could just be something, like not specifically said. So translating it flies is a little bit of a speculation.
Mhm.
Some people have speculated that this is a reference to like the Egyptian scarab beetles that are popularly depicted in their, religious text and artwork and stuff like that. But again, that's a speculation.
Basically, they just pick something bigger than that.
Yeah. Which is why I think that it's important to recognize the gnats and the swarms as distinctive, right? So whether you thought of the gnats as fleas or mosquitoes or lice, they're like biting, pestering, infesting things, right? So the swarms is like an intensification of that, but still distinct from it. Okay. 24. And the Lord did this. Thick swarms of flies went into Pharaoh's palace and his officials' houses. Throughout Egypt, the land was ruined because of the swarms of flies. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, go sacrifice to your God within the country. Because remember, Moses had said, we need to go 3 days' journey into the wilderness to sacrifice to God, right? And Pharaoh was now trying to bargain, right? Like, okay, fine, do your sacrifices, but don't leave. Stay. Remain my servants, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
26. But Moses said it would not be right to do that because what we will sacrifice to the Lord our God is detestable to the Egyptians. If we sacrifice what the Egyptians detest in front of them, won't they stone us? We must go a distance of 3 days into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Lord our God as he instructs us. Okay. There's a little bit of baggage with that as well, right? So on the one hand, Moses' excuse that what they're going to do is detestable to the Egyptians, that's true, because they're sacrificing animals that in certain religious practices in Egypt are considered sacred, right? But they're also going into the wilderness to the east. So Egypt, in general, their religion is centered on Ra, the sun god. He's the high god of the Egyptians, right? His son is supposed to be Pharaoh. Where does the sun rise? in the East. So there was this religious tradition in the East, or in Egypt, to look at the entire span of directions that the sun would rise in over the course of the year as the land of Ra, like his place that was owned by him, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it would be very offensive for the Israelites to say, yes, we're going to go into that place and not worship him, worship our God instead,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's definitely some fighting words there
Mm-hmm.
in that idea. Pharaoh responded, I will let you go and sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, but don't go very far. Make an appeal for me. As soon as I leave you, Moses said, I will appeal to the Lord, and tomorrow the swarms of flies will depart from Pharaoh, his officials, and his people. But Pharaoh must not act deceptively again by refusing to let the people go and sacrifice to the Lord, because that's what happened last time,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then Moses left Pharaoh's presence and appealed to the Lord. The Lord did as Moses had said. He removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh, his officials, and his people. Not one was left. But Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also and did not let the people go. So there you have it again. Exactly what he said he wasn't going to do, that's what he does. It's also worth pointing out that apparently in between the end of chapter 7 and the beginning of chapter 8, Moses finds his spine. Right? Because the whole time previous to this, when God was telling him, you do this thing, I will be with you, I'm going with you, you do this thing, come on, you're on my side. Moses is looking for any excuse he can find to not do it.
Mm-hmm.
And the moment he meets resistance, he goes, God, you set me up for failure, right? Well, now apparently he's kind of coming around.
Mm-hmm.
He kind of gets it. Like, God's totally winning this. He's going to wipe the floor with Pharaoh. This is going to go exactly the way God said, and Moses finally gets it. Right? So good for him. All right. Chapter 9. Then the Lord said to Moses, go into Pharaoh and say to him, this is what Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. But if you refuse to let them go and keep holding them, then the Lord's hand will bring a severe plague against your livestock in the field, the donkeys, horses, camels, herds, and flocks. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing of all the Israelites own will die. And the Lord set a time, saying, tomorrow the Lord will do this thing in the land. The Lord did this the next day. All the Egyptian livestock died, but none of the Israelite livestock died. Pharaoh sent messengers who saw that not a single one of the Israelites' livestock was dead. But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not let the people go. Now, remember what I said about the timing not being explicit and specific in a lot of these things? So I'm pointing that out because there's no explanation of how much time passes between this plague with the death of the livestock and the 7th plague later in this chapter that says that the livestock died. Right? We don't know if it was 2 days, 2 months, a year, 2 weeks. We don't know, right? It's just not said. What we get is phrases like, tomorrow this thing will happen, or the next day, right? But there's not enough of those that you can string together a chronology, a timeline of starting at date X and ending at date Y. All of these things happened, right? There's a couple of little signposts that we're going to get that are related to harvesting. But that's not enough to map out the entire timeline of all the plagues that happened. So we don't really know if this happened over days or months or longer. Verse 8. Then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of furnace soot, and Moses is to throw it toward the heaven in the sight of Pharaoh. It will become fine dust over the entire land of Egypt. It will become festering boils on man and beast throughout the land of Egypt. So they took furnace soot and stood before Pharaoh. Moses threw it toward heaven, and it became festering boils on man and beast. The magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils, For the boils were on the magicians as well as on were on the magicians as well as on all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not listen to them, as the Lord had told Moses. So the magicians are mentioned yet again in this, right? Only this time because they're completely powerless. They can't do anything, right? They can't even appear before Moses. So you know they're not doing their normal temple services either. So far we've had, they've lost the use of the Nile. Their concepts of order and the way things are supposed to go in terms of fertility are turned upside down. Their religious system falls apart and isn't functioning anymore. And none of the people who are supposed to be able to do something about it, the priests and Pharaoh, can actually do anything. At best, they can make it worse, but they can't fix it. They can't make the chaos go away. They can't make the order come back. 13. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning and present yourself to Pharaoh. Tell him this is what Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. Otherwise, I'm going to send all my plagues against you, your officials and your people. Then you will know that there is no one like me in all the earth. By now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague, and you would have been obliterated from the earth. However, I have let you live for this purpose, to show my power and to make my name known in all the earth." So that's kind of an explicit pointer to what the purpose of this whole exercise is, right? "You are still acting arrogantly against my people." Some translations say you are still obstructing them by not letting them go. "Tomorrow at this time I will rain down the worst hail that has ever occurred in Egypt from the day it was founded until now. Therefore give orders to bring your livestock and all that you have in the field into shelters. Every person and animal that is in the field and not brought inside will die when the hail falls on them." Now, if you're looking for nits to pick, then you would say, "But I thought all the livestock died." Well, like we said.
They talk about even in the boils.
So, like we said, there's not specific times given between when the 5th plague and the 7th plague happened, right? We don't know. Apparently they were replaced. Either that, or as is acceptable in the writing style of this period, you can use phrases like all of this or all of that and not have to actually mean literally every single one. In this style of writing at this time, it's perfectly acceptable to say all and mean many.
Like, I'm starving to death, not actually dying.
Right. It's like saying, well, it's like we talked about in some conversation we had, I don't remember what, but if I say like, yeah. See, I like that translation you pointed out, Jim, because
You should read it.
Jim posted in the ESV, it says, "You are still exalting yourself against my people and not letting them go," as a different translation for 9:17. See, I like that because it sort of reminds us that the problem with Pharaoh is that he exalts himself against God. The problem is that he holds himself up as God's rival, right? If he was the sort of person that would acknowledge that he had no power here, this whole exercise would have been done a long time ago. But like we were saying about exaggeration, if I say that insurance costs an arm and a leg, and I still have both arms and both legs, I'm not being deceptive and lying, right? I'm using a figure of speech. And in this style of writing at the time this was done, this was perfectly acceptable. So anyway. 20, yeah. "Those among Pharaoh's officials who feared the word of the Lord made their servants and livestock flee to shelters. But those who didn't take the Lord's word seriously left their servants and livestock in the field." So why are officials in Pharaoh's court paying attention to what God says? Because they get it, right? Because it's obvious to them that Pharaoh is not really the one in control here, and God is. It's obvious to them that this Moses guy keeps showing up and saying stuff will happen, and then it happens, and then this Moses guy asks his God to make it go away, and it does. We should probably pay attention to this guy because our Pharaoh is not able to do anything about this. 22. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand toward heaven, and let there be hail throughout the land of Egypt, on man and beast, and every plant of the field in the land of Egypt." So Moses stretched out his staff toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail. Lightning struck the earth, and the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. The hail, with lightning flashed through it, was so severe that nothing like it had occurred in the land of Egypt since it had become a nation. And I'm going to point out that the multiple references to lightning, right? The plague is about hail. The plague is about what the hail is doing. It's killing people and animals and destroying crops, right? That's the plague. Why do we have multiple references to thunder and lightning? Because thunder and lightning are commonly associated with visions of God. Thunderbolts and lightning, very, exactly, right? Because what's the whole point of the plague? God is doing this, right? Mm-hmm. So having this language repeatedly brought up about thunder and lightning makes you think of, oh, wait a minute. Doesn't God show up on the mountain with thunder and lightning? That's right, he does, doesn't he? Right? It's signpost language going, hey, remember, this is God's doing. Yeah, 25. Throughout the land of Egypt, the hail struck down everything in the field, both man and beast. The hail beat down every plant of the field and shattered every tree in the field. The only place it didn't hail was in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites were. Because remember, the Israelites were going to be specifically protected in all of these cases. Ironically, the Israelites are specifically protected in all these cases, and any of the Egyptians who choose to do what Moses said. Yeah. Right? That's that's an interesting thing to me. And we'll talk about that later in a few chapters from now, right? But even the people who aren't part of God's covenant are given the opportunity to obey God and be spared this problem. I think there's something important there. Anyway, 27. Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron. "I have sinned this time," he said to them. "Yahweh is the righteous one, and I and my people are the guilty ones. Make an appeal to Yahweh. There has been enough of God's thunder and hail. I will let you go. You don't need to stay any longer." Moses said to him, "When I have left the city, I will extend my hands to Yahweh. The thunder will cease, and there will be no more hail, so that you may know the earth belongs to Yahweh. As for you and your officials, I know that you still do not fear Yahweh our God." He's not fooled, right? He knows exactly what's going on here. Lip service. "The flax and the barley were destroyed because the barley was ripe and the flax was budding. But the wheat and the spelt were not destroyed, since they are later crops." So this is really the only hint we have for this particular plague about when the timing was, right? And this is going to become, this will be sort of important later when we do the Passover thing, because Passover is, of course, associated with harvest time, right? But this is really the only explicit thing we get as far as seasonal timing of the plagues. Mm-hmm. 33. Moses went out from Pharaoh in the city and extended his hands to the Lord. Then the thunder and hail ceased, and rain no longer poured down on the land. When Pharaoh saw that the rain, hail, and thunder had ceased, he sinned again and hardened his heart, he and his officials. So Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not let the Israelites go, as the Lord had said through Moses. So there he goes again, right? Saying one thing, doing another. We're going to go ahead and cut this off here, because 10 and 11 kind of go nicely with 12. So we'll cover that all next week. And to just kind of recap this, we had 7 more plagues described in these 2 chapters. And as the chapters went on, it becomes increasingly clear to the religious leadership in Egypt and Pharaoh and the Israelites and anybody who's paying attention that God is in control and Pharaoh is not. That God can either create or destroy order. He can either impose order or impose chaos at will, however he wants. And Pharaoh can't do anything about it. And the reason God is doing this is so that everyone will know, so that everyone will see, so it will be obvious to everybody who's paying attention, God is exactly who he says he is. And Pharaoh has no power there. That's really kind of the overarching point of this bit of the narrative, right? And Moses, for his part, is starting to get it. He's starting to see. Later on, we'll point back to this part because while Moses sees what's going on and understands God is who he says he is, the Israelites don't. So despite being witnesses to the stuff that happens and the beneficiaries of God's protection, the Israelites are going to have problems obeying what God says, and instead they're going to do a lot of complaining. But that's going to come up later. I'm pointing it out now so that when we come back to it in a few chapters, we can remember and go, oh, that's right. Despite the fact that all this stuff happened, they completely missed the boat and didn't get it. They didn't pick up what they were supposed to pick up. Mm-hmm. So Jim comments, many ancient cultures believed that a nation's God was only powerful in their land and not other lands, so Yahweh is showing them wrong. Yes, this is true. It would have been expected for the Egyptians to look at Yahweh as a regional deity, as something that came from the region of the Canaanites, right? Which is partly why that thing we talked about earlier about them wanting to go into the land that was supposed to be owned by Ra and do their sacrifices there. That's part of why that would have been so absurd and annoying to them, is because that's not supposed to be their territory, right? And again, like Jim points out, it would have been reasonable for them to think that in Egypt, Egyptian gods had power. They don't. They're completely lost, right? Okay. We'll go ahead and sign off here. See you all later. Have a good night. I have to expand the window.
Awkward.
Awkward, right?